She called it a welcome home dinner. That was the first lie. I remember standing in the doorway of what used to be my own kitchen, watching my daughter-in-law move around the stove like she owned the place, which I suppose by that point she believed she did. My name is Harold. I'm 67 years old, retired after 31 years as a pharmacist at Walgreens in Dayton, Ohio. My wife, Beverly, passed 4 years ago from pancreatic cancer. Took her fast. 3 months from diagnosis to the day I sat beside her bed holding her hand while the monitors went quiet. After that, the house on Maple Creek Drive felt like a museum. Every room had something of hers in it. Her reading glasses on the nightstand. Her handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the refrigerator with a little ceramic cardinal magnet she'd bought at a craft fair in 1998. My nephew stood in my living room and in I'm told me that on my house Nancy were worried about me being alone. Said their house in Columbus had the extra room since the kids were grown. Said it would be good for all of us. I should have said no. I almost did. But grief does something to your judgment. It softens the edges of things that should stay sharp. I sold the house on Maple Creek Drive in March, made $287,000 after fees, which I deposited into my savings along with Beverly's life insurance. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. Comfortable enough that I didn't need anything from anyone. I want to be clear about that. I never asked Garrett and Tanya for a single thing. The first few weeks were fine. Tanya kept the guest room clean, cooked on weeknights, smiled every time I walked into a room. Garrett seemed happy having me there. We watched baseball together on Sunday afternoons, the way we used to when he was a kid. I thought maybe this would work. Then the little things started. It began with comments at dinner. Tanya would look across the table and say something like, "Harold, you really should think about updating your will. Things get complicated when everything's left vague." I'd nod and change the subject. Then a week later, my cousin went through probate for 2 years because her father-in-law didn't have the right paperwork. It was such a mess. Another nod. Another subject change. I noticed Garrett never said anything during these conversations. He'd look at his plate or refill his water, or suddenly remember he needed to check something on his phone. My son, who once argued with a referee at his Little League game for 10 minutes straight, suddenly had nothing to say. About 6 weeks in, Tanya brought home dinner from a barbecue place downtown. She set everything out nicely, made a point of fixing my plate herself, pulled the chair out for me. There was something almost ceremonial about it. The way she placed the container in front of me, the way she smiled. "I got you the brisket," she said. "Extra sauce, I know you love it." She was right that I liked brisket. What she didn't know, couldn't have known because we'd never discussed it, was that I'd developed a sensitivity to one of the most common food-grade preservatives used in commercially smoked meats. I'd identified it myself 2 years ago when I kept having dizzy spells and elevated heart rate after eating certain cured foods. As a pharmacist, I knew what to look for. That night, about 40 minutes after dinner, my heart started racing, not dramatically. Just that low, unpleasant flutter you feel behind your sternum that tells you something isn't right. I'd felt it before. I knew what it was. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought for a long time. It could have been the preservative. It probably was, but the way she'd handed me that plate, the deliberate care of it, the smile, stayed with me in a way I couldn't shake. I didn't say anything. I just started paying attention. The next thing I noticed was my blood pressure medication. I take lisinopril, have for 11 years. I know what my prescription looks like. I know the dosage. I know the color and shape of the pills. One morning I opened my pill organizer and found tablets that looked slightly different. Same basic color, but the imprint was wrong. I'm a pharmacist. I spent 3 decades identifying medications by sight. These were my lisinopril. I pocketed the pills without taking them and drove myself to a pharmacy 3 miles away, one I never used since moving to Columbus. Asked the pharmacist, a young woman who reminded me a little of Beverly at that age, to identify them for me. She ran them through the database and looked up at me with an expression I recognized. Professional concern. The kind of face you make when you're about to say something the other person doesn't want to hear. "These are metoprolol," she said. "It's a beta blocker. It's commonly prescribed, but it's not your medication. The dosage here is pretty high for someone who isn't already on it." I thanked her. I drove home. I went to my room and sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the backyard where Garrett had hung a bird feeder the week before. I want to tell you that I was angry. I wasn't, not yet. What I felt was something colder than anger, something that took shape very slowly, like ice forming on a window overnight. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I started keeping a notebook. I bought it at a drugstore, a plain blue composition notebook, the kind kids use for school. I kept it in the inside pocket of my winter coat, which hung in my closet, and which neither Garrett nor Tanya had any reason to touch. Every evening before bed, I wrote down what had happened that day. Conversations. Tanya's comments about finances. The dates I found anything unusual with my medication. The time she offered to organize my pill case for me. The time I overheard her on the phone in the hallway saying, "He doesn't suspect anything. He's just old. He's just old." I wrote that down and underlined it twice. A few days after finding the switched medication, Garrett came into the living room while I was reading and sat down across from me with the expression of a man who has been rehearsing a conversation. Tanya was in the kitchen. I could hear her moving around. "Dad," he said, "Tanya and I have been talking. We think it might make sense for you to add her to your financial accounts, just for convenience in case something happens to you and we need to access things quickly." I looked at my son. He was 41 years old. He had his mother's eyes and apparently someone else's judgment. "I appreciate the thought," I said. "I'll look into it." I did not look into it. What I did instead was call my attorney, a woman named Pamela I'd used for estate planning when Beverly was sick. I told her what was happening. Not everything. I didn't have enough yet, but enough. She told me to document everything, to not change any financial accounts or documents under any circumstances, and to call her the moment anything escalated. It escalated 2 weeks later. I'd been sleeping lightly since the medication incident, the way you do when part of your brain refuses to fully stand down. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement in the hallway. Quiet, careful footsteps. Then the soft sound of my bedroom door opening. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing even. Tanya stood in the doorway for a moment. I heard her take a few steps into the room, then the small sound of my nightstand drawer opening. My pill case was in there. I heard the faint click of it opening, then closing, then the footsteps retreating. In the morning, I checked the pill case. The pills inside were not mine. That was the moment the cold feeling finally became anger. Clean, clear, quiet anger. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that makes plans. I called Pamela that morning from my car, parked in a grocery store lot with the radio off. I told her everything. She told me it was time to involve law enforcement and that she would make some calls. She also told me, and I want to say this part clearly, because a lot of people in my situation might not know, that what Tanya had done by entering my room and altering my medication without my knowledge or consent was not a gray area. It was a crime. That same week, I learned the full extent of what Tanya had been planning. Pamela called me with information from a title company she'd contacted. Someone had recently requested documents related to the property I owned. A small rental house in Dayton that Beverly and I had purchased in 2009 and that generated modest income every month. The request had included a power of attorney document bearing my signature. I had never signed a power of attorney. I sat with that for a moment, a long moment. My rental property was worth roughly $195,000. Combined with my savings and Beverly's life insurance, someone had decided I was worth more to them managed than free. The detective assigned to the case was a calm, methodical man who reminded me of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. No drama, just facts, next steps. He told me they would need to move carefully to build the case properly. I told him I had a notebook. He looked at me and for the first time almost smiled. "Keep writing," he said. Over the following 3 weeks, I went about my life in that house as normally as I could manage. I ate the meals Tanya cooked, although I made a habit of switching portions when she wasn't looking or eating beforehand when possible. I responded to Garrett's financial suggestions with vague, non-committal answers. I let Tanya believe that whatever she was putting in my pill case was working, that I was perhaps a little more tired, a little more foggy, a little more easy to manage. I was none of those things. There was one dinner in particular I won't forget. Tanya had made pot roast, which she knew I liked, and she'd set the table with the good placemats Beverly had picked out years ago, which she'd kept when I moved in, another small cruelty I'd noticed and written down. She put my plate in front of me with both hands, the way a server in a nice restaurant might, and she smiled the smile I'd come to understand was a performance. "You need to keep your strength up," she said. I looked at the plate. Then I looked at her. Then I smiled back. "You're absolutely right," I said. "Thank you, Tanya." While she went back to the kitchen for the bread, I swapped my plate with the serving dish that had already been set aside for seconds. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cinematic. It was just a quiet exchange, done in about 4 seconds, and then I sat back down and picked up my fork. I don't know exactly what was in that pot roast. The lab eventually identified a compound consistent with a sedative, not lethal at the level present, but enough to cause significant drowsiness and disorientation in an elderly person, enough to make someone compliant, enough to make a man of 67 feel, perhaps, like he was simply fading. Garrett got sick that night. Not dangerously, he recovered by morning, but sick enough that Tanya was visibly shaken in a way that had nothing to do with concern for her husband. I stayed in my room and wrote in my notebook. The arrests happened on a Tuesday morning, which is a strange day for a life to change, but there it is. I was sitting on the back porch with my coffee when 2 unmarked cars pulled into the driveway. The detective came to the back gate and told me they were ready to move. I nodded and went inside and sat in the kitchen while they executed the search warrant. Tanya was in the living room when they found the documents, printed copies of the forged power of attorney, handwritten notes about my accounts, and on her laptop, a series of emails with a notary whose license, it turned out, had been under investigation for an unrelated matter. The emails were detailed. Tanya was a planner. She laid out the entire scheme in writing, which is the kind of thing that makes prosecutors very happy. She looked at me from across the living room as they led her toward the door. I don't know what she expected to see on my face. Whatever it was, I don't think she found it. Garrett was in the kitchen with me. He hadn't been charged. There wasn't evidence he'd known about the medication or the forged documents, though I believe, and will always believe, that he understood more than he admitted. He sat at the table with his hands around a coffee mug and didn't speak for a long time. Finally he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I looked at him, at my son, Beverly's son, the boy I'd coached in Little League and driven to college and walked through every hard thing a young man goes through, and I felt the full weight of what had happened in that house. Not just what Tanya had done, but what Garrett had allowed. The silence he'd chosen dinner after dinner, while his wife made plans for my fading. "I know you are," I said, that was all. Tanya was charged with elder abuse, attempted fraud, forgery of a legal document, and criminal tampering with food and medication. Under Ohio law, those charges carried serious weight. Her public defender, she'd burned through what money she had on the notary's legal fees before the case even went to trial, negotiated a plea. She received 14 years with eligibility for parole review after 10. The forged power of attorney was voided. My rental property in Dayton remained mine. My accounts were unchanged. Pamela filed a civil claim on my behalf for legal fees and damages, which was settled 8 months later for an amount I won't specify, but which covered everything I'd spent, and then some. I moved back to Dayton in the fall. Not Maple Creek Drive. That house was someone else's now, with someone else's life filling up the rooms. I found a smaller place on the east side, a one-story with a good porch and a yard that gets afternoon sun. I put up a bird feeder the first week. Garrett called me about 2 months after I moved. We talked for a while. Not about everything, not yet, but about baseball, about the weather, about a fishing trip we used to take every summer when he was young. that we'd stop taking at some point without meaning to. I didn't tell him I'd forgiven him because I hadn't, not fully, and I didn't want to say something I didn't mean. But I answered the phone, and I kept talking, and I think that was its own kind of statement. There's something I want to say to anyone listening to this who is older, who was moved in with family because you were lonely or grieving or just tired of doing everything alone. I want to say, your instincts are right. If something feels wrong, it is wrong. You did not spend 60 or 70 years learning how people work only to stop trusting what you know in the room that matters most. I was a pharmacist. I knew what my medication looked like. I knew the weight of a tablet in my hand, the imprint, the color. That knowledge saved my life. But it wasn't just the pharmacist in me that knew something was wrong. It was the father, the husband, the man who had sat beside the woman he loved for 43 years and learned, over all of that time, to read the room, write it down, make the call. That's all I did, and I am still here to tell you about it. I think about that blue composition notebook sometimes, how ordinary it looked, how I bought it at a drugstore on a Tuesday afternoon, paid cash, carried it home in a plastic bag like it was nothing, and how it ended up being the most important thing I owned. There's something I've come to understand about the way life works, not in any mystical sense, but in the plainest, most practical one. Actions accumulate. Every choice a person makes adds itself to a ledger that eventually, one way or another, gets read aloud. Tanya made her choices. She chose to enter my room in the dark. She chose to swap out my medication. She wrote those emails, careful and detailed, mapping out exactly what she intended to do with a man she decided was too old to fight back. And every one of those choices became a line in a case file. What she built in secret became the thing that undid her. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because it's simply true. The plan she constructed so carefully, the forged signature, the notary, the emails, all of it became evidence. You cannot build something on deception and expect it to hold. The structure gives way. It always does. What I keep returning to is this. I almost didn't write anything down. That first night, after the brisket and the racing heart, I sat on the edge of my bed and almost convinced myself it was nothing, that I was tired, that I was grieving Beverly and reading danger into ordinary things. I almost let that voice win, but there was something else in me. Call it 31 years behind a pharmacy counter. Call it the part of a man that refuses to be made into something smaller than he is, that said, write it down anyway. If you're wrong, you've lost nothing. If you're right, you'll need it. That willingness to trust my own perception, even when part of me wanted to dismiss it, is what I'd tell anyone to hold on to. Not arrogance, not suspicion of everyone around you, just the quiet, firm refusal to talk yourself out of what you already know. Your mind has been working for 6 or 7 decades. It has learned things. Let it tell you what it sees. And then there's what Garrett taught me, though not in any way he intended. My son is not a bad man, but he made a choice, many choices, dinner after dinner, to look at his plate instead of at his father. He told himself that staying quiet wasn't the same as participating. It is. Silence in the face of something wrong is its own kind of action. It has its own consequences. Garrett lost his marriage, his home as he knew it, and 2 years of the kind of relationship with his father that neither of us will ever fully recover. That wasn't Tanya's doing. That was the cost of the choice he made every time he refilled his water glass and said nothing. I moved back to Dayton. I put up a bird feeder. I answer Garrett's calls. I'm 67 years old, and I'm still here, and I still know the weight of a tablet in my hand. That's not nothing. That's everything.